When I was there in the early 1990s, there was a major discovery, and that was that there appeared to be this new mutation that was associated with certain forms of breast cancer and ovarian cancer, BRCA1 and BRCA2. And clearly this was going to have major implications for women's health. And then there became further information that it might have a higher degree of there might be a few very clear mutations associated with the Ashkenazi Jewish population. Well, this was about 1994 at that point, and I thought, this is an interesting issue, and this has got a lot of ethics questions behind it, because NIH wanted to do a study in Washington, D.C. area with the Ashkenazi Jewish population to see if they get a better handle on whether or not this was more common in that community. Well, I was interested in studying, based on this eugenics story, what impact genetic information has in certain communities. So this was like, wow, and I mean, and I am in this community. So I got involved in working on the development of the study, and it was one of the first times that there was an interest in, when they got consent, they were not only going to ask consent with respect to using the samples for this, but also asking permission if they could use the samples for future studies about cancer and future studies. They didn't actually have to do it that way back then because it was de-identified by name. But as I'd argued, it wasn't de-identified by ethnicity or race. So the stigma associated with it, if there was a stigma, was still identifiable. It just wasn't to the individual. So this created a whole evolution of a conversation between informed consent and disclosure and research rights and who gets to control the samples. It's still going on today, as you know. But that was an interesting real-world study to be involved in. And it was fascinating because the synagogues had to decide how to, whether they were going to control or not who was going to be tested. Because they had people in their synagogues who were converts. They were not Ashkenazi Jews. They had converted, but they didn't want to exclude them. So they would come in, they'd give their, feel good about giving, they probably then went and threw it out. But it was an interesting question about being a community. The other interesting thing about it was the roles the rabbis played, because they were kind of recruiters. And so that raised some interesting ethical questions too. That it also happens in the black churches with sickle cell issues. But this interconnection between identity, like the Jewish gene, I mean, most people that have BRCA1 and 2 are not Jewish because there's so few Jews in this country anyway, but there is some association that has evolved from that. So, do you want to have genetics associated with certain groups that then become stigmatizing? And in the Jewish community, I did some empirical work on this. What makes someone identify as being Jewish? Is it a religion? Is it an ethnicity? Well, one of the only things that holds Jews together sometimes is their fear of anti-Semitism, or this Holocaust and the history of all of that. And, of course, as generations move forward, that may become less of an issue. So the irony of all of this is, like, in one way, the Jewish community is saying, this is great, we're learning more, we're studying about this in our population. And on the other hand, is it going to stigmatize it? Are we going to be redlined in certain areas? And it was like on a collision course, about getting this more information. Well, as a result of all of this, I got increasingly more interested in fears of genetic discrimination and privacy concerns, because the studies were showing that people didn't want to participate in research because, remember, they're healthy. And the risk-benefit analysis of when you're healthy is very different than the risk-benefit analysis when you're sick. Because I just believe, when you're sick, you're not really worrying about all of those things. You want to just know you're going to get well, and whatever they need to do that, do it. But when you're healthy, your risk-benefit analysis is different because it's predictive information. What does it mean then for your future? And then who do you tell, and who do you keep a secret from, and when do you tell your children? And what does it do to the group dynamic of blood relatives versus people that aren't blood relatives? I mean, there's all these complicated issues. So I started to write and think about that. And there was, at the NIH, a consortium that developed together to look at BRCA1 and 2 and its implications. So that was in the early to mid probably 1990s. That consortium model, 20 years later, still exists.